The train wheels clattered against the rails with a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat during the 3-day journey from Baltimore to Colorado Territory. Catherine Hartwell pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching. The endless expanse of prairie grass give way to distant mountain peaks that jutted into the afternoon sky like ancient stone sentinels. Her reflection stared back from the glass, auburn hair pinned in a simple but elegant style, green eyes that had seen too much hardship for her 26 years, and a face that her late aunt had once called pleasingly refined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn leather satchel at her feet contained everything she owned. 2 changes of clothing, her mother's pearl earrings, a daguerreotype of her parents taken before the fever claimed them, and most importantly, the letters from Thomas Brennan. 17 letters in total, each one carefully preserved in chronological order, tied with a blue ribbon that had once adorned her wedding dress to another man in what felt like a different lifetime. Catherine's fingers traced the outline of the final letter through her dark wool traveling dress. Thomas Brennan's last correspondence had arrived just 3 weeks ago, confirming arrangements for their marriage upon her arrival in Millbrook, Colorado. The letter spoke of his successful mining supply business, his comfortable 2-story house on Elm Street, and his eagerness to welcome a wife who could bring refinement and companionship to a town that sorely lacks both. What the letters hadn't mentioned was that Thomas Brennan was dead. The train's whistle shrieked as they approached Millbrook Station, a modest wooden platform surrounded by buildings that spoke of prosperity, built on the promise of gold and silver extracted from the surrounding mountains. Catherine gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency, her movements betraying none of the anxiety that had been building since Pittsburgh, when a chance conversation with a fellow passenger had first planted seeds of doubt about her decision. "Traveling alone, miss?" the conductor asked as he helped her down the train steps onto the platform. His weathered face showed the concern typical of railroad men who had seen too many women arrive in frontier towns, unprepared for the realities they would face. "I'm expected," Catherine replied with more confidence than she felt, scanning the small crowd that had gathered to meet the afternoon train. Thomas Brennan had described himself as tall, with dark hair and brown eyes, wearing a distinctive silver watch chain that had belonged to his father. She searched the faces of the waiting men, but none seemed to match the description from his letters. The platform emptied quickly as passengers were claimed by family members or business associates. Catherine stood alone beside her trunk, the weight of uncertainty pressing down upon her like the thin mountain air. The sun hung lower in the sky than she had expected, casting long shadows across the dusty main street that stretched away from the station. "Miss Hartwell?" The voice came from behind her, deep and hesitant. Catherine turned to find a man approaching slowly, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He was indeed tall, with dark hair and brown eyes, but something about his manner suggested reluctance rather than the eager anticipation Thomas Brennan's letters had promised. "Yes, I'm Catherine Hartwell," she replied, offering a smile that she hoped appeared more confident than she felt. "Mr. Brennan, I presume?" The man's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion, Miss Hartwell. My name is Marcus Brennan. Thomas was my brother." The word "was" hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face as the implication became clear. "Was," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Brennan nodded gravely, his brown eyes reflecting what appeared to be genuine sorrow. "Thomas died 2 weeks ago, a mining accident up at the Silver Creek site. I'm terribly sorry that word didn't reach you in time to prevent your journey." The platform seemed to tilt beneath Catherine's feet. Everything she had planned, everything She had sacrificed to make this journey possible, crumbled in an instant. Her savings were exhausted by the train fare. Her position as a seamstress in Baltimore had been given to another woman. The boarding house room she had called home for, the past year, was now occupied by someone else. She had burned every bridge to reach this moment, and now she stood stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a week's lodging. "I see," she managed, though the words felt hollow and inadequate. "I'm terribly sorry. For your loss, Mr. Brennan. Thomas spoke of you fondly in his letters, though he never mentioned you were twins." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "Identical twins, actually. Thomas always said people couldn't tell us apart, though I suppose our personalities were different enough." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made Catherine uncomfortable. "May I ask what your plans are now? Surely you don't intend to return east immediately?" The question Catherine had been dreading forced her to confront the harsh reality of her situation. "I'm afraid I haven't had time to consider alternatives," she admitted. "The journey consumed most of my resources, and I had not anticipated this complication." Marcus glanced around the now empty platform, then back to Catherine with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You can't stand here indefinitely. Please allow me to help you with your trunk. The Millbrook Hotel is comfortable enough, and it will give you time to determine your next course of action." As Marcus lifted her heavy trunk with surprising ease, Catherine noticed the silver watch chain hanging from his vest pocket, the same chain Thomas had described in his letters as a family heirloom. The sight of it brought fresh pain, a reminder of all the plans that would never come to fruition. The walk to the hotel took them down Millbrook's main thoroughfare, a wide dirt street lined with wooden buildings that spoke of a community built with optimism and determination. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one corner, its doors swinging open to release the sounds of laughter and piano music into the early evening air. Across the street, Murphy's General Store displayed bolts of fabric and household goods in its large front windows, while the Millbrook Bank and Trust occupied a surprisingly substantial brick building that suggested the town's financial success. Thomas often wrote about the town's growth, Catherine observed, trying to fill the awkward silence that had settled between them. He seemed quite proud of Millbrook's prospects. "He was instrumental in much of it," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a note of pride mixed with grief. "The mining supply business he built provided equipment and materials for half the claims in the area. He had a gift for seeing what people needed before they knew they needed it." They paused in front of a 3-story wooden building with Millbrook Hotel painted in elegant script across its facade. The structure was well-maintained and welcoming, with flower boxes beneath the first-floor windows that spoke of a proprietor who took pride in appearances. "Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable establishment," Marcus explained as he carried Catherine's trunk up the front steps. "The rooms are clean, the food is adequate, and she doesn't tolerate any nonsense from the miners who sometimes forget their manners after a successful day at the claims." The hotel lobby was indeed respectable, furnished with well-made if simple furniture and decorated with landscape paintings that captured the dramatic beauty of the Colorado mountains. Behind the registration desk, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and intelligent blue eyes looked up from her ledger. "Marcus Brennan," she said warmly, then noticed Catherine and modulated her tone to one of professional courtesy. "Good evening, miss. How may I help you?" "Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Catherine Hartwell," Marcus began, then paused, as if uncertain how to explain the situation. "She's traveled from Baltimore and finds herself in need of accommodation while considering her options." Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes moved from Marcus to Catherine, clearly sensing there was more to the story than the simple introduction suggested. "Of course. I have a lovely room on the 2nd floor with a view of the mountains. How long will you be staying with us, Miss Hartwell?" I'm not certain, Catherine admitted. Perhaps a few days while I make arrangements. Very well. The rate is $2 per day, including breakfast and dinner. Payment in advance, if you please. Catherine opened her small purse and counted out $6, leaving her with less than $4 to her name. The transaction felt like sealing her fate, committing her to a course of action she had not yet determined. As Mrs. Patterson prepared the room key, Marcus lingered beside Catherine, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Hartwell, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I believe Thomas would want me to ensure your welfare during this difficult time. Perhaps tomorrow we might discuss the situation more thoroughly. There may be possibilities we haven't considered." Something in his tone made Catherine look at him more closely. "What sort of possibilities, Mr. Brennan?" "Well," Marcus said carefully, "Thomas spoke of you often in recent weeks. He was quite taken with your letters, particularly your descriptions of your work as a seamstress and your interest in establishing a proper dressmaking establishment. Millbrook has no such business currently, and there's certainly demand among the wives of successful miners and businessmen." The suggestion was practical and appealing, but Catherine sensed there was more behind Marcus's offer than simple business advice. "That's very kind of you to consider, Mr. Brennan, but establishing a business would require capital I simply don't possess." "Perhaps not as much as you might think," Marcus replied. "Thomas had made certain preparations for your arrival, investments in equipment and supplies that might be adaptable to your needs." He paused, then added quietly, "I believe he would want those resources to benefit you, even though circumstances have changed so dramatically." Mrs. Patterson returned with the room key, interrupting what was becoming an increasingly complex conversation. "Room 12, Miss Hartwell. Up the stairs and to your left. Will you be dining with us this evening? Supper is served until 8 o'clock. "Yes, thank you," Catherine replied, accepting the key. She turned to Marcus, uncertain how to conclude their interaction. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your kindness more than I can express. Perhaps we might continue our conversation tomorrow when I've had time to process recent developments." Marcus nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Of course. Shall we say 10 o'clock? I could show you Thomas's shop and the preparations he had made. It might help you understand the possibilities I mentioned." After Marcus departed, Catherine climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Room 12 was indeed comfortable, with a brass bed covered in a colourful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small desk positioned beneath the window that looked out over the main street toward the mountains beyond. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed and carefully removed Thomas Brennan's letters from her satchel, spreading them across the quilt in chronological order. The progression told a story of growing enthusiasm and affection, beginning with formal responses to her advertisement in the Baltimore Sun and evolving into personal revelations about his hopes for their future together. The third letter had been the turning point, where Thomas had moved beyond practical considerations to share his vision of their life in Millbrook. "I confess, Miss Hartwell, that your description of the dresses you create has captured my imagination. You write with such passion about transforming simple fabrics into garments that make women feel beautiful and confident. Millbrook desperately needs such services, and I believe you could build a thriving business here while also gracing our community with your presence." By the 8th letter, Thomas had begun making specific plans. "I have spoken with Murphy about dedicating a section of his store to fine fabrics and notions that would support a proper dressmaking establishment. He is enthusiastic about the prospect, particularly given the number of successful families in Millbrook who currently must send to Denver for quality clothing. I confess I take great pleasure in imagining your shop busy with customers who appreciate your artistry." The letters painted a picture of a man who had genuinely cared about Catherine's dreams and ambitions, rather than simply seeking a housekeeper and companion. The loss of such a partner before she had even met him felt like losing a future she had allowed herself to believe in. A knock at the door interrupted her melancholy reverie. "Miss Hartwell?" Mrs. Patterson's voice called. "I've brought some hot water for washing, and I wondered if you might join me for a cup of tea before supper. You look as though you could use some friendly conversation." Catherine opened the door to find the hotel proprietor holding a steaming pitcher in one hand and a tea service on a small tray in the other. The older woman's expression held a combination of curiosity and genuine concern that suggested she understood more about Catherine's situation than their brief lobby conversation had revealed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Patterson. I would welcome the company." Mrs. Patterson entered and set the tea service on the small desk, then filled the wash basin with hot water. As Catherine refreshed herself after the long journey, Mrs. Patterson prepared the tea with efficient movements that spoke of years of hospitality experience. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, dear, but you have the look of someone who's received unexpected news," Mrs. Patterson observed, handing Catherine a delicate china cup. "Marcus Brennan's involvement suggests this has something to do with poor Thomas." Catherine accepted the tea gratefully, finding comfort in the simple ritual. "You knew Thomas well as anyone in Millbrook, I suppose. He was a good man, honest in his business dealings and generous with those less fortunate. His death was a genuine shock to the entire community." Mrs. Patterson settled into the room's single chair, her manner encouraging confidence. "May I ask how you came to know him?" The question required a decision about how much to reveal. Catherine chose honesty, sensing that Mrs. Patterson was someone who could be trusted with difficult truths. "We corresponded after I answered his advertisement for a wife. I traveled from Baltimore expecting to marry him, only to learn upon arrival that he died 2 weeks ago." Mrs. Patterson's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Oh, my dear girl, what a terrible shock that must have been. And Marcus met you at the station? That was thoughtful of him, though I imagine it couldn't have been easy for either of you. He mentioned possibilities for my future here in Millbrook," Catherine said carefully. "Something about Thomas having made preparations for a dressmaking business. Do you know anything about such plans?" Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. "Thomas had been quite excited about something in recent weeks, making inquiries about commercial space and speaking with Murphy about special orders of fabrics and notions. We all assumed it had to do with his upcoming marriage, though he was rather secretive about the details." "And Marcus? What can you tell me about him?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. The Brennan twins were as different as two men could be while sharing the same face. Thomas was outgoing, optimistic, always ready with a smile and a kind word. Marcus is more reserved, some might say brooding. He works the mining claims rather than running a business in town, and he's known for keeping to himself. "But he seems genuinely concerned about my welfare," Catherine observed. "I'm sure he is," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "The Brennan family has always taken their responsibilities seriously. If Thomas made commitments regarding your future, Marcus would feel obligated to honor them, regardless of his personal feelings about the situation." The conversation was interrupted by the dinner bell ringing from the hotel's dining room. Mrs. Patterson rose, collecting the tea service. "You must be hungry after your journey. The dining room serves excellent beef stew on Wednesdays, and there are usually several other travelers staying here who make for pleasant dinner companions." Catherine followed Mrs. Patterson downstairs to a comfortable dining room where a half-dozen guests were already seated at tables covered with cheerful red-checkered cloths. The other diners included a traveling salesman, an elderly couple visiting their son who worked at one of the mining claims, and two women who appeared to be sisters travelling together. The beef stew proved to be as excellent as promised, accompanied by fresh bread and butter that reminded Catherine of her mother's cooking. The conversation was light and pleasant, focusing on travel experiences and observations about Millbrook's continued growth and prosperity. Catherine found herself relaxing for the first time since stepping off the train. The simple pleasure of good food and friendly company providing respite from the day's emotional turmoil. After dinner, Catherine returned to her room and prepared for bed, hanging her travelling dress carefully in the small wardrobe and laying out her second-best dress for the following day's meeting with Marcus Brennan. As she brushed her auburn hair in the mirror above the washstand, she considered her limited options. Returning to Baltimore was financially impossible and professionally pointless, since her former position had already been filled. Remaining in Millbrook would require finding employment or establishing a business, neither of which seemed feasible given her limited resources. Yet Marcus Brennan's suggestion about Thomas's preparations for a dressmaking establishment offered a glimmer of hope that she hadn't dared to fully consider. Catherine climbed into the comfortable bed and pulled the colourful quilt up to her chin, listening to the sounds of Millbrook settling into evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a piano played softly from one of the saloons, and the occasional clip-clop of horses' hooves on the dirt street provided a gentle rhythm that gradually lulled her toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was of the strange twist of fate that had brought her across the continent to marry one man, only to find herself dependent upon his identical twin for any hope of building a future in this mountain town that was supposed to have become her home. Morning sunlight streamed through the hotel room window, casting geometric patterns across the wooden floor as Catherine dressed with particular care. She had chosen her navy blue dress with ivory trim, the most professional-looking garment in her limited wardrobe. The reflection in the small mirror showed a woman attempting to project confidence despite the uncertainty that had kept her awake for much of the night. At precisely 10 o'clock, Catherine descended to the hotel lobby to find Marcus Brennan waiting, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. In the bright morning light, the resemblance between the twins became even more apparent, or perhaps more unsettling. This was the face Thomas Brennan would have worn, the eyes that would have looked at her with anticipation, rather than the careful reserve she now encountered. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same deep timbre she remembered from Thomas's letters describing his own voice. "I trust you slept well despite the circumstances." "As well as could be expected, thank you," Catherine replied, accepting his offered arm as they stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. "I find myself quite curious about these preparations you mentioned." Marcus guided her down Main Street toward a row of commercial buildings she hadn't noticed in her emotional fog the previous evening. The morning bustle of Millbrook revealed a community more prosperous and established than she had initially realized. Well-dressed women supervised children playing in the dusty street, while men in business suits conducted conversations outside the bank. The scene suggested opportunities for someone with the right skills and resources. "Thomas leased this building 3 months ago," Marcus explained, stopping before a narrow, 2-story structure wedged between Murphy's General Store and Hoffman's Bakery. The ground floor featured large windows that would provide excellent natural light, while a smaller apartment above could serve as living quarters. He had grand plans for converting it into something special. Marcus produced a key from his vest pocket and unlocked the front door, revealing a space that took Catherine's breath away. The previous tenant had apparently been a furniture maker, leaving behind sturdy wooden tables at the perfect height for cutting fabric, built-in shelving along one wall that would be ideal for storing bolts of material, and a raised platform near the front window that seemed designed for fittings, but it was the contents of several wooden crates scattered around the room that truly amazed her. Marcus lifted the lid of the nearest crate, revealing bolts of silk, wool and cotton in colors and patterns that would have cost a fortune in Baltimore. Another crate contained sewing notions, threads, buttons, ribbons, and laces of every conceivable variety. A third held what appeared to be the components of a professional-grade sewing machine, still in its original packing. "Thomas ordered all of this?" Catherine asked, running her fingers over a bolt of emerald silk that would have been beyond her means in Baltimore. "He corresponded with suppliers in Denver and even St. Louis," Marcus confirmed. "Said he wanted to ensure you had everything necessary to establish the finest dressmaking establishment west of the Mississippi River." His voice carried a note of pride mixed with sadness. "Thomas always believed in doing things properly." Catherine moved through the space, her trained eye automatically assessing the possibilities. The layout was nearly perfect for a dressmaking shop, with areas that could be designated for consultations, fittings, and the actual construction of garments. The apartment upstairs would eliminate the need for separate lodging, reducing her expenses significantly. "The lease has 6 months remaining," Marcus continued, watching her examine the space. "Thomas paid in advance, naturally. He wanted everything ready for your arrival." The magnitude of Thomas's investment became clear as Catherine continued exploring. Beyond the fabrics and equipment, he had arranged for specialized lighting fixtures to reduce eye strain during detailed work, purchased a set of dress forms in various sizes, and even commissioned custom-built storage solutions from the local carpenter. "I don't understand," Catherine said finally, turning to face Marcus. "This represents a substantial investment, far more than anyone would reasonably spend on speculative business venture. Why would Thomas commit so much without being certain I would accept his proposal?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the emerald silk Catherine still held. "Thomas was confident in his assessment of your character based on your correspondence. But more than that, he genuinely believed in your talent and the potential for success here in Millbrook." He paused, then added quietly, "He also mentioned that you had indicated some urgency in your need to relocate, though he didn't specify the reasons." The observation brought a flush to Catherine's cheeks. Her final letter to Thomas had, indeed, hinted at circumstances that made remaining in Baltimore impossible, though she had been deliberately vague about the details. The truth that her former employer's son had made increasingly inappropriate advances that culminated in an assault she had barely escaped was not something she could have explained to a potential husband through correspondence. "There were personal reasons that made a fresh start necessary," Catherine admitted carefully. "Thomas seemed to understand the need for discretion about such matters." Marcus nodded, not pressing for elaboration. "In that case, perhaps we can find a way to honor his intentions while addressing your current situation." He gestured toward the stairs leading to the apartment above. "Shall we examine the living quarters?" The upstairs apartment was modest but comfortable, consisting of a sitting room, bedroom, and small kitchen with a wood-burning stove. The furnishings were simple but well-made: a comfortable bed with a colorful quilt, a small dining table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the window overlooking Main Street. Thomas had clearly intended this space for Catherine's use, creating a home where she could live independently while building her business. The arrangements Thomas made suggest he expected our marriage to be a partnership rather than a traditional arrangement, Catherine observed, noting the apartment's emphasis on privacy and independence. "Thomas always respected intelligence and capability in others," Marcus replied. "He wouldn't have wanted a wife who required constant supervision or guidance. He preferred equals to dependence." As they returned to the shop space below, Catherine found herself overwhelmed by the possibilities and the tragic waste of Thomas's careful planning. Everything she had dreamed of creating was laid out before her: the space, the equipment, the materials, even the living arrangements. But the partnership that was supposed to make it all possible had been shattered by a mining accident. "Mr. Brennan," she began hesitantly, "I'm grateful beyond words for Thomas's faith in my abilities and his generous preparations. But surely you understand that I cannot simply assume ownership of property and goods that belong to his estate. There must be legal complications, family obligations, business debts that take precedence over arrangements made for a marriage that never occurred." Marcus leaned against one of the cutting tables, his expression thoughtful. "Actually, the legal situation is more complex than you might expect. Thomas restructured his affairs considerably in recent months, making provisions that would protect any investments related to your business venture, regardless of what happened to his other holdings." "What do you mean?" Thomas was not a careless man, Miss Hartwell. He understood that mining is dangerous work and that business partnerships can be complicated by unexpected events. Marcus paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "He created a separate legal entity for the dressmaking establishment, with provisions that would ensure your access to these resources even if something happened to him." Catherine stared at him in shock. "Are you saying Thomas legally protected my interest in this business before we were even married?" "I'm saying Thomas believed in your potential success strongly enough to ensure that potential couldn't be destroyed by circumstances beyond your control." Marcus straightened, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "However, there is one significant complication to the arrangement." The word complication sent a chill through Catherine. "What sort of complication?" Marcus walked to the front window, gazing out at the street activity while gathering his thoughts. "The legal documents Thomas prepared include provisions for a business partner who would provide guidance and support during the establishment phase. That partner was to be his wife, working alongside him to build something substantial here in Millbrook. But I'm not his wife," Catherine pointed out. "The marriage never took place." "Exactly." Marcus turned back to face her, his expression serious. "According to the legal framework Thomas established, the business partnership requires both parties to fulfill their commitments. Without a marriage, without the partnership he envisioned, the entire arrangement becomes void, and all these resources revert to his general estate." The crushing weight of disappointment settled over Catherine like a physical burden. For a brief, shining moment, she had allowed herself to believe that Thomas's preparations might provide the foundation for the independent life she had dreamed of creating. Now that possibility was being swept away by legal technicalities she couldn't have anticipated. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Then I suppose my situation is exactly as desperate as it appeared yesterday evening." "Not necessarily," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more urgent. "There is another way to honor Thomas's intentions while satisfying the legal requirements," he established. Catherine looked up sharply. "What way?" Marcus moved closer, his brown eyes, so achingly similar to Thomas's, fixed on her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "The marriage contract Thomas signed with you was quite specific about the business partnership and mutual support it would provide. From a legal standpoint, that contract could be honored by his heir, who would assume all rights and obligations Thomas had committed to. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Catherine felt her breath catch as she grasped what Marcus was suggesting. "You're proposing that you could take Thomas's place in the marriage contract," she said slowly, barely believing the words as she spoke them. "I'm suggesting that the commitment Thomas made to you shouldn't die with him," Marcus replied, his voice low and earnest. You traveled across the continent based on promises he made. You gave up your life in Baltimore, trusting in his word. The fact that fate intervened doesn't diminish the validity of those commitments or your sacrifice in honoring them. Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Mr. Brennan, we're complete strangers. Marriage is not a business contract that can be transferred from one party to another like a deed or a bill of sale. Isn't it? Marcus challenged gently. Your arrangement with Thomas was based on correspondence and mutual benefit rather than romantic attachment. You both understood the practical nature of the partnership you were creating. I can offer the same foundation for success, the same commitment to your independence and prosperity. The logic was undeniable, but something about the proposal made Catherine deeply uncomfortable. Why would you make such an offer? What possible benefit could you derive from marrying a woman you met yesterday? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting away from her face. Thomas spoke of you constantly in recent weeks, your letters, your dreams, your talent. He shared everything with me because he was genuinely excited about the future you would build together. When he died, it felt like watching two tragedies unfold simultaneously, his death and the destruction of the future he had planned for both of you. That doesn't answer my question, Catherine pressed. Why would you sacrifice your own freedom to honor commitments you didn't make? Because Thomas was more than my brother, Marcus replied, his voice carrying a depth of emotion she hadn't heard before. He was my closest friend, my business partner, and the person who always saw possibilities where I saw only obstacles. If I can preserve something he believed in, something that brought him genuine joy in his final weeks, then perhaps his death won't represent a complete loss. The explanation was touching, but Catherine sensed there were deeper motivations Marcus wasn't revealing. And what would you expect from such a marriage? What obligations would you place on a wife who agreed to such an unusual arrangement? Marcus met her gaze directly. The same obligations Thomas would have expected: partnership in building something meaningful, mutual respect, and genuine effort to make the arrangement successful for both parties. He paused, then added quietly, I wouldn't expect romantic love where none exists, but I would hope for friendship and loyalty. Before Catherine could respond, the shop door opened with a sharp jingle of the bell Thomas had installed. A woman entered, her expensive dress and confident manner suggesting she was among Millbrook's social elite. She was perhaps 40 years old, with blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style, and sharp blue eyes that took in the scene with obvious disapproval. Marcus Brennan, the woman said coldly, ignoring Catherine entirely. I heard you were showing this place to someone. I hope you're not planning to honor any of Thomas's ridiculous schemes now that he's gone. Marcus straightened, his expression hardening. Mrs. Wellington, I wasn't aware you had any interest in Thomas's business affairs. I have interest in anything that affects property values and community standards, Mrs. Wellington replied sharply. Her gaze shifted to Catherine with undisguised hostility. I assume this is the woman Thomas was planning to marry? The one who answered his advertisement like some common mail-order bride. The contempt in her voice was unmistakable, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Before she could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. Miss Hartwell is a respected businesswoman and skilled artisan, he said firmly. Thomas recognized her talents and made arrangements to help her establish herself in Millbrook. Those arrangements will be honored. Mrs. Wellington laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Honored by whom? Thomas is dead, Marcus. Whatever foolish promises he made died with him. Surely you don't intend to involve yourself in his romantic entanglements. I intend to ensure that Thomas's commitments are fulfilled, Marcus replied, his jaw tightening. Miss Hartwell has made considerable sacrifices based on those commitments. How touching, Mrs. Wellington said sarcastically. But let's be practical, shall we? This woman has no family in Millbrook, no connections, no social standing. The wives of successful businessmen aren't going to patronize a dressmaker who arrived here seeking a husband through newspaper advertisements. The whole arrangement is unseemly. Catherine found her voice, anger overriding embarrassment. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Wellington, but my personal circumstances don't diminish my professional qualifications. I've been creating custom garments for discerning clients for over 8 years. Mrs. Wellington's eyebrows rose mockingly. In Baltimore, how impressive. I'm sure the standards there are quite adequate for provincial tastes. Her smile was razor-sharp. But Millbrook's leading families have more refined expectations. We certainly wouldn't patronize someone with such questionable origins. The attack was deliberate and vicious, designed to humiliate Catherine and undermine any confidence she might have gained from Marcus's proposal. The older woman clearly saw her as a threat to be eliminated rather than a potential contributor. And to the community. Furthermore, Mrs. Wellington continued, warming to her theme, I understand you traveled here alone, without proper chaperonage, expecting to marry a man you'd never met. Such behavior raises serious questions about your character and judgment. That's enough, Marcus said sharply, moving to stand beside Catherine in a gesture of protection and support. Miss Hartwell's character is beyond reproach, and your insinuations are both unfounded and unwelcome. Mrs. Wellington's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. How gallant of you, Marcus, but defending her won't change the fundamental problem. Millbrook has standards to maintain. We can't have just anyone setting up shop and claiming respectability, simply because Thomas Brennan had romantic notions about playing benefactor to wandering seamstresses. The cruelty of the attack left Catherine speechless. In a few sharp sentences, Mrs. Wellington had reduced her dreams to shameful desperation and transformed her skills into inadequate pretensions. The worst part was the grain of truth in the accusations. She had traveled across the continent to marry a stranger. She had no connections in Millbrook, and her social standing was indeed questionable by conventional measures. I think you've made your position clear, Mrs. Wellington, Marcus said coldly. Miss Hartwell and I have business to discuss, so if you'll excuse us. Of course, Mrs. Wellington replied smoothly, moving toward the door. I simply wanted to ensure there were no misunderstandings about community expectations. I'd hate for anyone to invest time and resources in ventures that are doomed to failure. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Wellington possessed the social influence to destroy Catherine's prospects before they could even begin. As the shop door closed behind her, the silence that remained felt oppressive and final. Catherine sank onto one of the wooden crates, the weight of defeat settling over her like a shroud. She's right, you know, she said quietly. I'm exactly what she described, a desperate woman who traveled across the continent seeking marriage to a stranger. No amount of skill or determination can overcome that fundamental reality. Marcus remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. Victoria Wellington represents the worst aspects of frontier society, people who achieved modest success and now spend their energy excluding others rather than building something meaningful. Her opinion carries weight only because people allow it to. But she does carry weight, Catherine pointed out, and without customers, the finest shop in the world is merely an expensive tomb for unused dreams. The truth of her assessment hung between them like a wall neither could breach. Thomas's careful preparations, Marcus's generous offer, Catherine's desperate hopes, all of it crumbled before the reality of social prejudice and economic power wielded by people like Victoria Wellington. There has to be another way, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. Thomas believed in your potential too strongly for it all to end like this. Catherine rose from the crate, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. Your brother sounds like he was a remarkable man, Mr. Brennan, But remarkable men sometimes have remarkable blind spots about the realities other people face. She moved toward the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. I appreciate everything you've tried to do, but I can't build a life on foundations that crumble at the first sign of opposition. Where will you go? Marcus asked, genuine concern in his voice. Catherine paused with her hand on the door handle. I have enough money for a few more days at the hotel. Perhaps I can find work as a seamstress for someone else, or secure passage to another town where my circumstances won't be quite so notorious. Catherine, Marcus said, using her first name for the first time, don't let Victoria Wellington destroy what Thomas tried to build. There are people in this town who would value what you have to offer. She turned back to look at him one final time, memorizing the face that might have belonged to the husband she would never have. Perhaps. But they weren't in this room when she made her position clear, were they? The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty shop like the sound of dreams dying. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hotel dining room as Catherine sat alone at a corner table, mechanically stirring her coffee, while staring out the window at Main Street. 3 days had passed since her confrontation with Victoria Wellington. 3 days spent wrestling with impossible decisions and dwindling resources. Her small purse now contained less than $2, enough for perhaps one more night at the hotel before she would be forced to make some desperate choice about her future. Mrs. Patterson approached with the coffee pot, her expression kind, but concerned. Another cup, dear. You've barely touched your breakfast. Catherine glanced down at the untouched eggs and toast on her plate. Thank you, but I'm afraid I'm not very hungry this morning. The hotel proprietor settled into the opposite chair, uninvited, her maternal instincts clearly overriding professional boundaries. Catherine, may I call you Catherine? I've been watching you these past few days, and I recognize the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. The unexpected kindness brought tears to Catherine's eyes that she quickly blinked away. I'm simply considering my options, Mrs. Patterson. Sometimes that requires careful thought, and sometimes it requires trusted advice, Mrs. Patterson replied gently. I've lived in Millbrook for 15 years, since shortly after my husband died, and left me with nothing but determination and a small inheritance. I understand something about being a woman, alone in a frontier town, trying to make a life from whatever materials are at hand. Catherine looked up sharply, recognizing something in the older woman's tone that spoke of personal experience with desperate circumstances. You built this hotel from nothing? From very little, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. A run-down boarding house that nobody wanted, a handful of mismatched furniture, and the conviction that travelers deserved better than the alternatives available at the time. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with memory. The established families in town made it quite clear that a widow in business was unseemly and doomed to failure. But you succeeded anyway. Eventually, but not without considerable struggle and more. Then a few nights when I wondered if the critics might be right. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her voice taking on an urgent quality. The difference between success and failure wasn't my business plan or my resources, Catherine. It was finding the right allies and refusing to let other people's limitations become my own. Before Catherine could respond, the dining room door opened to admit a woman she hadn't seen before, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair arranged in a practical style and intelligent hazel eyes that surveyed the room with quiet confidence. She wore a traveling dress of good quality but modest design and carried herself with the self-possessed manner of someone accustomed to managing her own affairs. Mrs. Patterson, the newcomer said warmly as she approached their table. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Helena, Mrs. Patterson replied, rising to embrace the newcomer with genuine affection. Catherine, I'd like you to meet Helena Morrison. Helena, this is Catherine Hartwell, The young woman I mentioned in my letter, Helena Morrison, extended her hand with a firm grip that spoke of practical experience. Miss Hartwell, I'm delighted to meet you. Mrs. Patterson wrote that you're a skilled dressmaker considering establishing yourself in Millbrook. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the description, which seemed to omit the more scandalous aspects of her situation. I was considering it, yes, though circumstances have proven more complicated than I anticipated. Circumstances often are, Helena replied with a knowing smile. May I join you? I have a proposition that might interest you, and I find business discussions are always more productive over good coffee. As Helena settled at their table, Mrs. Patterson poured fresh coffee for all three women. Catherine noticed that the hotel proprietor's demeanor had shifted subtly, taking on the focused attention of someone facilitating an important negotiation. Helena owns the largest ranch in the valley, Mrs. Patterson explained, the Circle M, about 10 miles south of town. She inherited it from her father 2 years ago and has been managing it independently ever since. My father believed in practical education for his daughters, Helena said with evident pride. By the time he died, I knew every aspect of ranch operations from horse breeding to accounting. The transition was smoother than anyone expected, though I did face some skepticism from neighboring ranchers who doubted a woman could manage such an enterprise. Catherine found herself intrigued despite her current pessimism. How did you overcome their doubts? Results, Helena replied simply. The Circle M has been more profitable under my management than it ever was under my father's. Success has a way of silencing critics, at least the reasonable ones. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat meaningfully. Helena, why don't you explain? Your proposal to Catherine? I think she'll find it quite interesting. Helena leaned back in her chair, studying Catherine with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating potential business partners. Miss Hartwell, I understand you have considerable skill in dressmaking and an interest in establishing yourself professionally. I have a problem that your skills might solve and resources that could benefit your ambitions. What sort of problem? Catherine asked cautiously. The Circle M employs 12 men year-round, with additional hands during busy seasons. These men work hard in difficult conditions, and they deserve better than the rough clothing available at Murphy's General Store, or through mail-order catalogs. Good work clothes are expensive to purchase and difficult to maintain, but a skilled seamstress could create durable, well-fitted garments at reasonable cost. Catherine's interest sharpened. You're suggesting I could make work clothing for your ranch hands? Among other things, Helena confirmed, but that's only the beginning. The Circle M generates substantial profits, Miss Hartwell, and I've reached a point where social obligations require a wardrobe more sophisticated than practical ranch wear. I need evening gowns for business dinners in Denver, day dresses suitable for entertaining visitors, and riding habits that combine functionality with elegance. The scope of the potential commission took Catherine's breath away. Custom garments for both working men and a successful businesswoman could provide steady income, while allowing her to demonstrate her skills to a broader audience. Furthermore, Helena continued, several neighboring ranch families have expressed frustration with the limited options available locally. The wives of successful ranchers have money to spend on quality clothing, but they currently must travel to Denver or even St. Louis for anything beyond basic necessities. A skilled dressmaker with reasonable prices and convenient access could build a thriving clientele. Mrs. Patterson smiled at Catherine's obvious interest. Helena has been discussing this possibility since she learned about your situation. She believes there's an untapped market for quality clothing services in this area. The question, Helena said, fixing Catherine with a direct gaze, is whether you're interested in building a business that serves working people rather than Millbrook's social elite. It would be different from what Thomas Brennan envisioned, but potentially more sustainable and certainly more independent. Catherine felt a flutter of hope in her chest, the first she had experienced since Victoria Wellington's devastating attack. I would be very interested in such an arrangement, but I'm afraid my resources are extremely limited at present. I lack the capital to purchase materials, rent space, or even maintain myself while building a clientele. That's where my proposition becomes more specific, Helena replied. The Circle M has a foreman's house that's been empty since my previous. Foreman married and built his own place closer to town. It's a comfortable dwelling with good light for detailed work, and it could serve as both residence and workspace. I would provide this accommodation at no cost in exchange for priority service for my clothing needs and those of my ranch hands. The offer was beyond generous, addressing Catherine's most pressing concerns while providing the foundation for the independent business she had dreamed of creating. Mrs. Morrison, such an arrangement would be extraordinarily beneficial for me, but what assurance would you have that I could deliver the quality and service you require? Helena reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a folded piece of fabric, silk, in a deep burgundy color with an intricate pattern that spoke of expensive taste. I brought this from Denver with the intention of having a dress made there. If you could create a design that demonstrates your capabilities, we could formalize our arrangement based on the results. Catherine accepted the silk with reverence, her trained eye immediately recognizing its superior quality and the possibilities it represented. The fabric was exquisite enough to create a gown worthy of the finest establishments in Baltimore or New York. I would need a few basic supplies, Catherine said, her mind already envisioning the design possibilities. Patterns, notions, access to a sewing machine. Thomas Brennan's shop, Mrs. Patterson interjected. All the equipment and materials are still there, aren't they? Helena looked puzzled. I thought that arrangement had ended when Thomas died. Catherine explained the situation with Marcus Brennan's proposal and the legal complications surrounding Thomas's preparations. As she spoke, Helena's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. So the resources exist, but accessing them requires marriage to Marcus Brennan. Helena summarized when Catherine finished. That was his suggestion, yes, though after Mrs. Wellington's intervention, I'm not certain such an arrangement would be practical, even if I were inclined to accept it. Helena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. Miss Hartwell, may I ask why you're so resistant to Marcus's offer? From a purely practical standpoint, it would solve your immediate problems while honoring Thomas's intentions. The question forced Catherine to examine motivations she had been reluctant to face directly. I suppose I'm uncomfortable with the idea of marriage as a business transaction. My first marriage was based on genuine affection, and the prospect of entering into a legal union without that foundation feels wrong somehow. But you were prepared to marry Thomas Brennan without having met him, Helena pointed out gently. Wasn't that also a business transaction of sorts? Catherine felt her cheeks warm. I suppose it was, though I had convinced myself that affection might develop over time. With Marcus, I'm not even certain we like each other, much less whether we could build a successful partnership. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her expression earnest. Catherine, dear, successful marriages have been built on far less than mutual respect and shared goals. If Marcus is willing to honor his brother's commitments, and you're willing to work toward making the arrangement beneficial for both parties, affection might indeed develop over time. But what if it doesn't? Catherine asked. What if we find ourselves trapped in a legal arrangement that makes both of us miserable? Helena smiled, an expression that suggested she understood something about taking calculated risks. Miss Hartwell, let me tell you something about business partnerships, because that's essentially what Marcus is proposing. The most successful partnerships I've seen are based not on emotional attachment, but on complementary skills, shared objectives, and mutual respect. If Marcus can provide access to resources and support, while you provide the expertise and industry, to build something meaningful, that's a stronger foundation than many marriages enjoy. Furthermore, Mrs. Patterson added, frontier marriages often begin as practical arrangements and develop into genuine partnerships over time. Love isn't always the starting point. Sometimes it's the destination. Catherine looked down at the burgundy silk still in her hands, feeling the weight of possibility and fear in equal measure. Even if I were to consider such an arrangement, Victoria Wellington made it clear that Millbrook's social leaders would oppose any business I attempted to establish. Without their support, or at least their tolerance, success would be very difficult. Helena laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. Miss Hartwell, Victoria Wellington's influence extends primarily to Millbrook's main street and the wives of a few established businessmen. Beyond those narrow circles, her opinions carry very little weight. The ranching families, the mining families, the working people who actually drive this region's economy, they care about value and quality, not social pretensions. Helena's right, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. Victoria Wellington represents old Millbrook, the small merchant families who were here first. But the real growth and prosperity in this area comes from mining and ranching, and those communities have different values and priorities. The question, Helena continued, is whether you want to build a business that serves Victoria Wellington's narrow social circle, or one that serves the broader community of people who need quality clothing and can pay fair prices for it. The latter market is much larger and more sustainable. For the first time in days, Catherine felt hope stirring in her chest. The prospect of building a business independent of Millbrook's social hierarchies appealed to her more than trying to win approval from people who had already decided to reject her. If I were to accept Marcus's proposal, Catherine said slowly, thinking through the implications, and if I were to focus on serving the ranching and mining communities rather than Millbrook's established families, what would be the practical steps toward establishing such a business? Helena's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. First, prove your capabilities with the dress I've commissioned. Second, formalize the arrangement with Marcus so you have legal access to Thomas's preparations. Third, begin taking commissions from the Circle M and use those successes to build reputation and clientele among other ranching families. It would mean starting over completely, Catherine mused, abandoning my original plans and building something entirely different. Sometimes starting over is exactly what we need, Mrs. Patterson said gently. I thought I wanted to recreate the life I'd had with my husband when I came to Millbrook. Instead, I built something completely different and discovered I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. Before Catherine could respond, the dining room door opened to admit Marcus Brennan himself, his hat in his hands and his expression uncertain. He approached their table hesitantly, clearly unsure of his welcome after their difficult parting 3 days earlier. Miss Hartwell, he said formally, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Morrison, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wondered if I might have a word with Miss Hartwell privately. Helena and Mrs. Patterson exchanged meaningful glances before rising from the table. We were just finishing our discussion, Helena said diplomatically. Miss Hartwell, please consider what we've talked about. I'll be in town through tomorrow if you'd like to continue our conversation. After the two women departed, Marcus took the seat Helena had vacated, his expression serious. I wanted to apologize for the other day, he began. Victoria Wellington's behavior was inexcusable, and I should have been better prepared to defend you against such attacks. Catherine studied, his face noting the genuine regret in his brown eyes. You couldn't have anticipated her hostility, Mr. Brennan. and ultimately her criticism contained enough truth to be effective. Her criticism was based on prejudice and social pretension, Marcus replied firmly. Your worth isn't diminished by the circumstances that brought you to Millbrook. Perhaps not, but those circumstances do affect my ability to build the kind of business Thomas envisioned. Mrs. Wellington made it clear that Millbrook's established families wouldn't patronize someone with my background. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgent quality. Catherine, what if I told you there was another way, a way to honor Thomas's plans while avoiding the social obstacles Victoria Wellington represents? What do you mean? Marcus glanced around the dining room, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard, then spoke quietly. Thomas's business connections extended far beyond Millbrook's main street. He supplied mining operations throughout the region, and those connections could provide access to markets Victoria Wellington can't influence or control. I don't understand. Mining camps and logging towns throughout Colorado Territory are filled with people who need quality clothing but have no access to skilled dressmakers. These communities have money from successful operations, but they're isolated from traditional retail sources. A dressmaker who could travel to these locations or arrange for goods to be delivered could build a substantial business independent of local social politics. The scope of Marcus's vision took Catherine's breath away. Instead of competing for approval from Millbrook's social elite, she could serve communities that genuinely needed her skills and had the resources to pay for quality work. But such an approach would require substantial investment in materials, equipment for traveling, connections with suppliers and transporters, Catherine pointed out. The logistics alone would be overwhelming for someone starting with nothing, which brings us back to the original proposal, Marcus said quietly. Thomas's preparations weren't just about creating a local dressmaking shop. He intended to establish a regional business that could serve multiple communities. The equipment he purchased, the supplier relationships he established, the transportation arrangements he made, all of it was designed to support the larger vision. Catherine felt her pulse quicken as she grasped the full implications of what Marcus was describing. You're talking about something far more ambitious than I had imagined. Thomas always thought big, Marcus confirmed. He saw possibilities where others saw only problems. And he believed your skills and determination could support ventures much larger than a simple local business. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside the hotel. Through the dining room windows, Catherine could see a group of well-dressed women gathering in the street, their animated gestures and stern expressions suggesting they were discussing something of considerable importance. Marcus followed her gaze and grimaced. Victoria Wellington's friends, I'd guess. They probably know I'm here and are speculating about our relationship. As if summoned by his words, the hotel door opened to admit 3 women Catherine recognized from Sunday services. Mrs. Wellington's closest allies in Millbrook's social hierarchy. They approached the table with the determined stride of people on a mission. Mr. Brennan, the leader of the group, said coldly, ignoring Catherine entirely, "We've come to express our concern about certain arrangements we understand you're considering." Marcus rose politely, but his expression remained guarded. "Mrs. Caldwell, Mrs. Foster, Mrs. Blake, what arrangements concern you?" Mrs. Caldwell, a sharp-faced woman with graying hair, gestured dismissively toward Catherine. "We understand you're contemplating marriage to this person in order to honor some misguided commitment your deceased brother made. Such an arrangement would be highly inappropriate and damaging to your family's reputation." The public nature of the confrontation made Catherine's cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she forced herself to remain seated and composed. Marcus, however, straightened to his full height, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. My personal affairs are not subject to community approval, Mrs. Caldwell, and I'll thank you not to refer to Miss Hartwell in such dismissive terms. Mrs. Foster, a plump woman with calculating eyes, stepped forward. Marcus, dear, we're trying to help you avoid a terrible mistake. This woman has no family connections, no social standing, and frankly, her presence here under such circumstances raises serious questions about her character. What questions about her character? Marcus demanded, his voice rising slightly. Mrs. Blake, the youngest of the three, delivered what was clearly intended as the killing blow. She traveled across the continent to marry a man she'd never met, Marcus. What sort of decent woman does such a thing? And now that Thomas is dead, she's clearly seeking to entrap you into honoring obligations you never made. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Catherine felt the familiar weight of shame and anger that had plagued her since Victoria Wellington's initial attack. But before she could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Miss Hartwell," he said clearly, his gaze never leaving the three women, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal, delivered in the midst of hostile confrontation, stunned everyone present into silence. Catherine stared at Marcus, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there during their private conversations. Not just determination, but defiance, and perhaps even affection. Catherine began, her voice catching. "I'm asking you to marry me," Marcus continued, his voice carrying throughout the dining room, "not out of obligation to Thomas, but because I've come to respect your courage, admire your talents, and believe we could build something meaningful together." The sincerity in his voice, the public nature of his declaration, and the defiant timing of his proposal combined to create a moment of perfect clarity for Catherine. These women, these social gatekeepers, who sought to control her destiny through shame and exclusion, represented everything she had traveled across the continent to escape. Marcus Brennan, whatever his flaws or limitations, offered genuine partnership and the chance to build something significant. "Yes," Catherine said clearly, rising to stand beside him, "I will marry you, Marcus Brennan." The gasps and whispered exclamations from the three women provided a satisfying counterpoint to the smile that spread across Marcus's face. But it was the sound of applause from the hotel lobby that truly captured Catherine's attention. Mrs. Patterson and Helena Morrison stood in the doorway, beaming with approval and clearly having witnessed the entire exchange. "Well," Mrs. Caldwell said stiffly, her face flushed with indignation, "I suppose that settles the matter, though I can't imagine what Thomas would think of such a theatrical display." "Thomas would approve completely," Marcus replied with conviction. "He always believed in choosing partnership over prejudice, possibility over social pretension." As the three women departed in obvious displeasure, Marcus turned to Catherine with an expression that mixed triumph with vulnerability. "I hope you don't regret accepting such an unconventional proposal under such difficult circumstances." Catherine looked into his brown eyes, so like Thomas's, yet increasingly distinct in their own right, and felt something shift in her heart. "I don't regret it, Marcus. In fact, I think it may have been exactly what we both needed." Helena Morrison approached their table, her face radiant with excitement. "Congratulations to you both. And Catherine, I hope this means you'll still consider my proposition about burgundy silk. A wedding dress would be the perfect way to demonstrate your capabilities." Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had since arriving in Millbrook. "Mrs. Morrison, I believe that's an excellent idea. After all, I'll need something appropriate to wear when I marry the most unconventional man in Colorado Territory." The engagement announcement spread through Millbrook like wildfire across dry grass. Within hours of Marcus's public proposal, the entire town buzzed with speculation, gossip, and divided opinions about the unusual match between Thomas Brennan's twin brother and the mail-order bride who had arrived too late to marry her intended groom. Catherine discovered this firsthand when she ventured out the morning after accepting Marcus's proposal, only to find herself the subject of whispered conversations and pointed stares from every direction. She had risen early to visit Murphy's general store, hoping to purchase thread and basic notions needed for Helena Morrison's burgundy silk dress. The commission represented her first real opportunity to prove her capabilities, and she was determined to create something spectacular despite the limited resources at her disposal. What she hadn't anticipated was the gauntlet of social disapproval she would face simply walking down Main Street. The bell above Murphy's door announced her entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock the sudden silence that fell over the store's interior. 3 women who had been examining bolts of fabric near the counter turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Behind the counter, Mr. Murphy himself appeared uncomfortable, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by nervous fidgeting. "Good morning," Catherine said pleasantly, refusing to be intimidated by the unwelcoming atmosphere. "I'm looking for silk thread in burgundy, if you have it." Mr. Murphy glanced nervously at the other women before responding. "I'm afraid our thread selection is quite limited, Miss Hartwell," Catherine supplied, noting his reluctance to use her name. "Though I understand that will be changing to Mrs. Brennan quite soon." One of the women, whom Catherine recognized as Mrs. Foster from the previous day's confrontation, sniffed audibly. "How convenient for you that Thomas Brennan's death provided such an opportunity for advancement." The cruel implication sent heat rushing to Catherine's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Foster. I assure you my engagement to Marcus has nothing to do with advancement and everything to do with mutual respect and shared goals." "Shared goals," repeated another woman with obvious skepticism. "How romantic. I suppose those goals include access to the Brennan family's considerable assets?" Catherine felt her temper rising, but forced herself to speak calmly. "My goals, Mrs. Carlton, involve establishing myself as a skilled dressmaker and contributing positively to this community. If you're suggesting otherwise, I'd appreciate you speaking plainly rather than hiding behind insinuations." Mrs. Carlton's eyes flashed with malicious satisfaction. "Very well, I'll speak plainly. You arrived in Millbrook as a desperate woman seeking marriage to a stranger. When that arrangement failed due to circumstances beyond your control, you immediately set your sights on his brother. Such behavior raises serious questions about your character and motivations. The attack was direct and personal, designed to humiliate Catherine in front of witnesses who would undoubtedly spread the story throughout town. But instead of the shame and retreat her accusers expected, Catherine felt something harder crystallize in her chest. A determination not to be destroyed by people who knew nothing about her struggles or sacrifices. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Carlton," Catherine replied, her voice carrying clearly through the store. "I did come to Millbrook seeking marriage to a stranger, because remaining in Baltimore had become impossible for reasons I don't care to discuss publicly. When Thomas Brennan died, I was left in desperate circumstances with limited options. Marcus offered a solution that benefits both of us while honoring his brother's memory." The women exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such direct acknowledgement of facts they had intended to use as weapons. "If that makes me calculating or opportunistic in your eyes," Catherine continued, "I can live with your disapproval. What I cannot live with is being driven from a community where I hope to build a life and contribute my skills simply because a few people have decided my origins make me unworthy of consideration." Mrs. Foster stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Your origins are exactly the problem, Miss Hartwell. Millbrook has standards to maintain. We can't have just anyone claiming respectability simply because they've managed to entrap a grieving man into an ill-advised marriage." "Entrap?" Catherine's voice rose slightly, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I've done nothing but accept an offer of partnership from a man who understands the realities of frontier life better than you apparently do. If Marcus Brennan is fool enough to be entrapped by a destitute seamstress, perhaps you should direct your concerns to him rather than harassing me." The confrontation might have escalated further, but the store door opened to admit Helena Morrison, whose presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. The successful rancher surveyed the scene with intelligent eyes, clearly understanding the situation at a glance. "Catherine," Helena said warmly, ignoring the other women entirely, "I was hoping to find you here. I've brought some additional silk in complementary colors, in case you want to add decorative elements to the dress we discussed." The casual use of Catherine's first name and the obvious business relationship between the two women created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Foster and Mrs. Carlton clearly recognized Helena's status in the community. Her wealth and independence commanded respect even from those who disapproved of women in business. "Mrs. Morrison," Mrs. Foster said stiffly, "I wasn't aware you were acquainted with Miss Hartwell." "I've commissioned Catherine to create several garments for me," Helena replied pleasantly. "Her reputation for exceptional workmanship precedes her, and I'm delighted to have such talent available locally rather than having to travel to Denver for quality clothing." Catherine felt a surge of gratitude for Helena's strategic intervention. By positioning their relationship as an established business arrangement, Helena was lending her social credibility to Catherine, while making it clear that opposition to Catherine would mean opposition to Helena's interests. Mr. Murphy, perhaps, sensing an opportunity to extract himself from an uncomfortable situation, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrison, Miss Hartwell was asking about burgundy silk thread. I'm afraid our selection is limited, but I could place a special order if needed." "That won't be necessary," Helena replied, producing a small package from her bag. "I brought everything Catherine will need from Denver, including some specialty items not typically available in smaller communities." As Helena and Catherine concluded their business, the other women gradually departed, their whispered conversations suggesting the morning's confrontation would be thoroughly analyzed and reported throughout Millbrook's social circles. Once they were alone with Mr. Murphy, Helena's expression grew more serious. "Catherine, I hope you understand that opposition to your engagement won't be limited to verbal confrontations in public places. Victoria Wellington and her allies have considerable influence in this town, and they won't hesitate to use it against you and Marcus." Mr. Murphy nodded reluctantly. "Mrs. Morrison speaks truly, Miss Hartwell. The Ladies' Auxiliary controls much of the town's social calendar, and they've been known to pressure businesses to refuse service to people who've fallen from their favor." Catherine felt a chill of apprehension. "What sort of pressure?" "Boycotts, mostly," Murphy explained uncomfortably. "If the prominent families stop patronizing a business, it can be devastating. Most merchants can't afford to alienate their best customers, even for moral reasons." "Which is why," Helena interjected meaningfully, "it's important to build relationships with customers who aren't subject to such social manipulation. The ranching and mining communities operate by different rules and different priorities." As they left Murphy's store together, Catherine found herself walking beside Helena through streets that suddenly felt more hostile than welcoming. The casual greetings and friendly nods she had begun to expect were replaced by averted gazes and whispered conversations that ceased when she passed. "Is it always like this?" Catherine asked quietly. "The social politics, the factions, the pressure to conform," Helena considered the question thoughtfully. "Frontier communities often develop rigid hierarchies as a way of creating stability in chaotic environments. The families who arrived first or achieved success earliest often try to control growth and change by determining who gets accepted into their circles, and those who don't get accepted find other ways to succeed or leave, Helena replied pragmatically. The key is understanding that their acceptance isn't necessary for your success, only their inability to actively prevent it. They paused in front of Thomas Brennan's former shop, where Marcus could be seen through the window, organizing inventory and making preparations for Catherine's use of the space. The sight of him working methodically through his brother's carefully assembled resources brought a complex mix of emotions to Catherine's chest. "Are you having second thoughts about the engagement?" Helena asked, noting Catherine's expression. "Not second thoughts exactly," Catherine replied carefully. "But I'm beginning to understand the full scope of what Marcus and I are taking on. It's not just marriage, it's a business partnership and a social statement that will affect both our futures." "Most marriages are business partnerships, whether people acknowledge it or not," Helena observed. "The question is whether you and Marcus have compatible goals and complementary strengths. From what I've observed, you both bring valuable assets to the relationship." Before Catherine could respond, Marcus emerged from the shop, his face lighting up when he saw her. The genuine pleasure in his expression sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, a reminder that their arrangement was based on more than mere convenience. "Catherine," he said, approaching with easy familiarity. "Perfect timing. I found something I think you'll want to see." He led them into the shop where Thomas's carefully organized supplies had been arranged to create an efficient workspace. But it was a wooden crate near the back of the room that commanded Catherine's attention. Marcus lifted the lid to reveal bolts of fabric in colors and patterns she had never seen outside the finest establishments in Baltimore, silks, wools, and cottons that represented a small fortune in raw materials. "Thomas had been corresponding with suppliers throughout the East," Marcus explained. "This shipment arrived yesterday, apparently ordered months ago in anticipation of your arrival." Catherine ran her fingers over a bolt of deep blue wool that would create a stunning winter coat, then examined silk in subtle patterns that would make elegant evening wear. The quality and variety exceeded anything she had dared hope for, providing the foundation for the kind of sophisticated garments that could establish her reputation throughout the region. "There's more," Marcus continued, producing a thick folder from Thomas's desk. "Correspondence with potential customers in mining camps and railroad towns throughout Colorado Territory. Thomas had been marketing your services even before you arrived, using descriptions from your letters to generate interest in custom clothing services." Helena examined the correspondence with obvious interest. "These represent substantial opportunities. Catherine, mining superintendents, railroad executives, successful merchants in communities that currently have no access to skilled dressmaking. If you could fulfill even half these requests, you'd have more business than you could handle." The scope of Thomas's preparations became clear as Marcus continued revealing his brother's plans. Maps showing potential travel routes between communities, arrangements with freight companies for transporting finished goods, even preliminary designs for a mobile workshop that could be transported to remote locations for on-site fittings. "Thomas really believed this could work," Catherine said, awed by the thoroughness of his planning. "Thomas always saw possibilities where others saw only problems," Marcus confirmed. "But more than that, he understood that success in frontier communities requires thinking beyond traditional limitations." Their discussion was interrupted by a sharp knock at the shop door. Through the glass, they could see Victoria Wellington herself, flanked by two men Catherine didn't recognize. Marcus's expression hardened as he moved to unlock the door. "Mrs. Wellington," he said coldly, "gentlemen, what can I do for you?" Victoria Wellington entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting her way, her two companions following with the purposeful manner of men on official business. One was elderly with silver hair and expensive clothing that suggested wealth and authority. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone accustomed to physical confrontation. "Marcus," Victoria said without preamble, "I've come with Mr. Caldwell from the bank and Sheriff Morrison to discuss some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding this property and its contents." Catherine felt her stomach drop as she grasped the implications. Helena stepped closer, her expression alert and concerned, while Marcus straightened to his full height. "What irregularities?" Marcus demanded. Mr. Caldwell, whom Catherine now recognized as the bank president and husband of one of the women who had confronted her that morning, cleared his throat officiously. "There are questions about the legal ownership of certain items on these premises, Mr. Brennan. Specifically, expensive inventory that may not have been properly transferred before your brother's death. Everything in this shop was legitimately purchased by Thomas and properly documented," Marcus replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "I have the receipts and correspondence to prove it." Sheriff Morrison, a weathered man with graying hair, looked uncomfortable with his role in the confrontation. "Marcus, I'm sorry about this, but we've received a formal complaint alleging that valuable goods may have been misappropriated from Thomas's estate. We need to examine the documentation and secure the premises until ownership can be properly established." The legal maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. By questioning the ownership of Thomas's inventory, Victoria Wellington and her allies could prevent Catherine from using the materials and equipment necessary to establish her business, effectively destroying her prospects without direct confrontation. "This is ridiculous," Helena interjected, her voice sharp with indignation. Thomas Brennan's business affairs were conducted openly and honestly. Everyone in town knew about his preparations for Miss Hartwell's arrival. "Nevertheless," Mr. Caldwell replied smoothly, "proper legal procedures must be followed to protect all interested parties. Until estate matters are resolved, this inventory should remain under official supervision." Catherine felt the walls closing in around her as she grasped the full scope of the attack. Without access to Thomas's materials and equipment, she couldn't fulfill Helena's commission or any other potential orders. Her engagement to Marcus would appear to be exactly what her critics claimed, a desperate attempt to gain access to resources she had no legal right to claim. "How long would such legal procedures take?" Marcus asked grimly. Sheriff Morrison consulted a document one of the other men had handed him. "Estate matters can be complex, especially when questions of fraud or misappropriation are involved. Could be weeks, maybe months before everything gets sorted out." "Fraud?" Catherine's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You're accusing me of fraud?" Victoria Wellington smiled with cold satisfaction. "We're not accusing anyone of anything, Miss Hartwell. We're simply ensuring that proper legal procedures are followed to protect everyone's interests." The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but Catherine recognized the tactical brilliance of the maneuver. By couching their attack in terms of legal propriety and estate protection, Victoria Wellington and her allies had created a situation where opposing them would appear to be opposing law and order itself. "I want to see the complaint," Marcus demanded, his composure finally cracking. "Who filed it, and on what specific grounds?" Mr. Caldwell produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "The complaint was filed by concerned citizens who have Thomas's best interests at heart. The specific grounds include questions about the timing of certain large purchases, the propriety of premarital investments in business ventures, and the potential for conflicts of interest in estate settlement." As Marcus examined the complaint, his expression grew increasingly grim. Catherine could see from his face that the legal language was carefully crafted to raise questions that would be difficult to refute quickly, regardless of their ultimate validity. "This is a fishing expedition," Marcus said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. There's no evidence of wrongdoing here, just insinuations and speculation designed to create delays and complications. Perhaps, Victoria Wellington replied smoothly, but surely you understand that the appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as actual wrongdoing. For everyone's sake, it's better to resolve these questions properly rather than allowing them to fester. Sheriff Morrison began examining the inventory, making notes in a ledger, while Mr. Caldwell observed with obvious satisfaction. The process felt like watching vultures pick apart a carcass, transforming Thomas's careful preparations into evidence of questionable behavior. "What happens now?" Catherine asked quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Now, we wait," Victoria Wellington replied with false sympathy. "I'm sure everything will be resolved eventually, though these legal matters can be quite time-consuming. In the meantime, I suppose you'll need to make other arrangements for your business ventures." The triumph in her voice was unmistakable. Victoria Wellington had achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish, neutralizing Catherine's ability to establish herself independently while making it appear to be the result of legal necessity rather than social manipulation. As the officials continued their inventory of Thomas's shop, Catherine found herself standing beside Marcus and Helena, watching months of careful planning dissolve into bureaucratic procedure. The burgundy silk for Helena's dress remained in her possession, but without access to the equipment and materials in the shop, creating the garment would be exponentially more difficult. "This isn't over," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that sounded more like a threat. Victoria Wellington heard him and smiled with cold satisfaction. "Of course not, Marcus. These legal matters never are, but I'm sure you'll find that fighting windmills can be quite exhausting, especially when you have other responsibilities to consider." Her gaze shifted meaningfully to Catherine, the implication clear. The attack on Thomas's estate was just the beginning. Any attempt to move forward with their business plans or their marriage would face similar obstacles, each one designed to exhaust their resources and resolve until they finally admitted defeat. As they left the shop under Sheriff Morrison's watchful eye, Catherine felt the weight of despair settling over her like a shroud. The materials and equipment that represented her future were now locked away behind legal procedures that could drag on indefinitely. Her engagement to Marcus, which had seemed like salvation just hours earlier, now appeared to be a liability that would subject both of them to endless scrutiny and harassment. "We'll find another way," Helena said firmly as they walked back toward the hotel. "This is a setback, not a defeat." But Catherine could see the doubt in Marcus's eyes, the realization that Victoria Wellington's attack had been more effective than any of them had anticipated. The woman who had seemed like a mere social nuisance had revealed herself to be a formidable opponent with resources and influence they had underestimated. The war for Catherine's future had begun in earnest, and the first battle had been decisively lost. 3 weeks had passed since the legal seizure of Thomas's shop. 3 weeks of watching her dreams dissolve into bureaucratic delays and social hostility. Catherine sat in her hotel room at dawn, the burgundy silk spread across her small table like a mockery of her former ambitions. Without access to proper equipment, creating Helena's dress had become an exercise in frustration and improvisation that consumed far more time and effort than the commission warranted. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Catherine," Helena's, a voice called through the door. "May I come in?" Catherine opened the door to find Helena Morrison standing in the hallway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a woman Catherine had never seen before, perhaps 50 years old, with steel-grey hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. Her traveling dress was well made but practical, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Catherine, I'd like you to meet Judge Margaret Thornton," Helena said as they entered the room. "She's been hearing cases throughout the territory for the past 10 years, and she has some interesting perspectives on your current legal difficulties." Judge Thornton extended a firm handshake, her grip conveying strength and authority. "Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Morrison has told me quite a lot about your situation. I've also made some inquiries of my own regarding the complaint filed against Thomas Brennan's estate." Catherine gestured for them to sit, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Have you discovered something that might help resolve the matter?" Judge Thornton's smile was sharp as a blade. "I've discovered several things that I believe you'll find quite interesting. But first, I'd like to understand your intentions regarding Mr. Marcus Brennan and the business arrangements his brother established." The directness of the question caught Catherine off guard. "I intend to honor my engagement to Marcus and build the dressmaking business Thomas envisioned, assuming the legal obstacles can be resolved. And if they can't be resolved through conventional means." Catherine looked between Helena and the judge, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "I'm not sure what you mean by unconventional means." Judge Thornton leaned forward, her expression growing more intent. "Miss Hartwell, I've spent a decade adjudicating disputes in frontier communities, and I've learned to recognize certain patterns. What's happening to you isn't unusual. Established families using legal procedures to eliminate competition and maintain control over community development. But surely the law should protect against such manipulation. The law is only as effective as the people charged with implementing it," Judge Thornton replied grimly. "When local officials have personal or financial stakes in maintaining existing power structures, legal procedures can be corrupted to serve private interests rather than justice." Helena leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Judge Thornton has discovered some very specific information about the complaint against Thomas's estate, Catherine. Information that could change everything." Catherine felt her pulse quicken. "What sort of information?" Judge Thornton produced a folder from her leather satchel, spreading several documents across Catherine's small table beside the burgundy silk. "First, the complaint was filed not by concerned citizens as claimed, but by a consortium of Millbrook business owners who stand to benefit financially from preventing competition with existing enterprises." "What do you mean?" "Murphy's General Store has a monopoly on fabric and notions sales in Millbrook," Judge Thornton explained. "A successful dressmaking establishment would either compete directly with his textile business or require him to expand his inventory significantly to serve as a supplier. Either way, his profits would be affected." Catherine stared at the documents, beginning to grasp the scope of the conspiracy against her. "And Mr. Caldwell?" "The bank holds mortgages on several businesses that would face increased competition. If Millbrook became a regional center for quality goods and services," Helena added, "a thriving dressmaking business would attract customers from surrounding communities, potentially leading to other specialized services that would challenge existing monopolies." Judge Thornton nodded approvingly at Helena's analysis. "Exactly. Right? What they've done is create a legal framework that appears to be about estate protection, but is actually about economic control." "But how does that help us?" Catherine asked. "Even if we can prove their motivations, the legal procedures are still in place." "That's where things become interesting," Judge Thornton said, her smile returning. "The complaint alleges that Thomas Brennan made questionable purchases without proper authority. However, I've examined his business records and discovered that he restructured his affairs months ago to create a separate legal entity for the dressmaking venture." Catherine looked up sharply. "Marcus mentioned something about that. But I didn't understand the implications. The implications are substantial, Judge Thornton continued. Thomas created a formal business partnership with provisions that would automatically transfer ownership to his intended wife upon his death, regardless of what happened to his other assets. Legally speaking, you became the sole owner of the dressmaking business the moment Thomas died. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. Are you saying the inventory and equipment legally belong to me? I'm saying Thomas Brennan was far more sophisticated in his legal planning than anyone realized, Judge Thornton confirmed. The materials, equipment, and business arrangements aren't part of his general estate. They're assets of a separate entity that passed directly to you. Helena's eyes blazed with excitement. Which means the complaint filed by Caldwell and the others has no legal foundation. Worse than that, Judge Thornton replied with satisfaction. It means they've knowingly filed false claims and are currently in possession of property that legally belongs to Miss Hartwell. Under territorial law, that constitutes theft. Catherine felt dizzy as the implications washed over her. They stole my property and are using the legal system to prevent me from reclaiming it? Precisely. And they've done so in a way that assumes you lack the knowledge or resources to challenge their actions effectively. Judge Thornton's expression hardened. It's a common tactic used against newcomers and women, particularly those without family connections or established social standing. What can we do about it? Catherine asked, though she was beginning to sense that Judge Thornton hadn't come simply to deliver information. We can expose their fraud publicly and demand immediate return of your property, Judge Thornton replied. But doing so will require courage and commitment to see the process through to its conclusion, regardless of social or economic pressure they might apply. Helena reached across the table to squeeze Catherine's hand. Judge Thornton is offering to represent you formally, Catherine. She's willing to challenge the entire conspiracy in open court. The offer was more than Catherine had dared hope for, but she understood that accepting it would escalate the conflict beyond anything she had previously imagined. What would such a challenge involve? First, a formal hearing where I present evidence of the fraudulent complaint and demand immediate return of your property, Judge Thornton explained. Second, potential criminal charges against those who filed false claims and conspired to deprive you of lawful ownership, and the consequences of such actions. Judge Thornton's smile was predatory. For you, vindication and control of assets, worth several $1,000s. For them, public exposure, potential criminal charges, and destruction of their credibility in future business dealings. Catherine rose and walked to the window, looking down at Main Street, where the morning bustle of Millbrook continued obliviously. Somewhere in those buildings, Victoria Wellington and her allies were probably congratulating themselves on their successful neutralization of the troublesome newcomer. They had no idea that their victim had just been handed the legal weapons necessary to destroy them. There's one more thing you should know, Judge Thornton added quietly. Thomas Brennan wasn't the only businessman who anticipated interference from Millbrook's established families. I've discovered correspondence between him and several other entrepreneurs who were planning to establish competing enterprises in the area. Catherine turned back to face her visitors. What sort of enterprises? A competing general store, a restaurant that would serve meals more sophisticated than saloon fare, even plans for a small manufacturing concern that would produce mining equipment locally rather than importing it from Denver. Helena's voice carried excitement. Thomas was part of a group planning to transform Millbrook from a small market town to a true regional center. And Victoria Wellington's faction knows about these plans? They suspect, Judge Thornton confirmed, which is why they've been so aggressive in trying to eliminate you. Your success would prove that their control over community development isn't absolute, potentially encouraging other entrepreneurs to challenge their monopolies. The scope of the conflict suddenly became clear to Catherine. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival, she had become a symbol in a larger struggle over Millbrook's economic future. Success would inspire others to challenge existing power structures, while failure would reinforce the status quo and discourage future competition. "I need to discuss this with Marcus," Catherine said finally. "This affects him as much as it does me." "Actually," Helena said carefully, "Marcus is already involved in ways you might not realize. His mining operations compete directly with interests controlled by some of the same people who filed the complaint against Thomas's estate." Catherine stared at her. "What do you mean?" Judge Thornton consulted another document from her folder. "Marcus Brennan's mining claims are located in areas that Caldwell's bank has been trying to acquire for a consortium of Eastern investors. If Marcus were forced to abandon his claims due to financial pressure, those properties would become available at reduced prices. They're trying to destroy both of us simultaneously," Catherine realized with growing horror. "The attack on Thomas's estate isn't just about preventing my business. It's about forcing Marcus into financial difficulties that would compromise his mining operations." "Exactly," Judge Thornton confirmed. "They've created a situation where defending you requires resources that Marcus can't afford to spend without endangering his own livelihood. It's a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to eliminate multiple threats to their economic control." The revelation transformed Catherine's understanding of everything that had happened since her arrival in Millbrook. What she had interpreted as social prejudice and personal animosity was actually systematic economic warfare, designed to preserve monopoly control over the region's development. "How long do we have before Marcus's situation becomes critical?" Catherine asked. Helena consulted her own notes. "Based on what I've observed, he's been covering legal expenses and supporting you while neglecting his mining operations for nearly a month. If this continues much longer, he'll be forced to choose between defending the estate case and maintaining his claims." "Which means they win regardless of what he chooses," Catherine said grimly. "Unless we act decisively to expose their conspiracy and recover your property immediately," Judge Thornton interjected. "With your legal ownership established and your business operational, you could generate income that would support both ventures." While they're being challenged in court, Catherine returned to her chair, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "What exactly would be required from me?" "Public testimony about the circumstances of your engagement to Thomas, the nature of his business preparations, and your intentions regarding the dressmaking establishment," Judge Thornton replied. "You would need to present yourself as a legitimate businesswoman rather than an opportunistic fortune hunter, which means addressing the gossip and speculation about your character directly. In other words, I'd have to defend not just my legal rights but my personal reputation before the entire community. Yes, and you'd have to do so knowing that failure would result in complete destruction of your prospects here, while success would make you permanent enemies of some very powerful people." Catherine looked down at the burgundy silk, thinking of Helena's commission that remained unfinished due to lack of proper equipment. The fabric represented everything she had hoped to achieve in Millbrook: quality work that would build her reputation and establish her independence. But it also represented the obstacles that had been systematically placed in her path by people who saw her success as a threat to their own interests. "When would such a hearing take place?" Catherine asked finally. "I can request an emergency session for tomorrow afternoon," Judge Thornton replied. "The fraudulent nature of the complaint justifies expedited proceedings, especially since valuable property is being unlawfully detained." "Tomorrow?" Catherine's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The longer we wait, the more time they have to consolidate their position and prepare counter-strategies," Helena pointed out. "Judge Thornton's presence in Millbrook is temporary. If we don't act while she's here to represent you, the opportunity might not come again." Catherine rose and walked to where her few possessions were arranged on the small dresser. Among them was the packet of letters from Thomas Brennan, still tied with the blue ribbon that had once adorned her wedding dress, to another man in what felt like a different lifetime. The letters represented the dreams and plans that had brought her across the continent, dreams that had been transformed by circumstances she could never have anticipated. "If I agree to this course of action," Catherine said slowly, "and if we succeed in recovering my property and exposing their conspiracy, what happens then? Do you really believe they'll simply accept defeat and allow me to build my business in peace?" Judge Thornton's expression grew somber. "No, I don't believe that. Success in this legal challenge will establish your rights and expose their methods, but it won't eliminate their hostility or their ability to create other obstacles. What it will do is prove that their control isn't absolute and encourage others who might support your ventures. In other words, this is just the beginning of a longer struggle. Most meaningful changes require sustained effort over time," Helena observed. "But you wouldn't be fighting alone. There are people in this community and throughout the region who would benefit from the competition and opportunities your success would create." Catherine returned to the window, watching Marcus emerge from the hotel across the street where he had been staying since their engagement. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the weight of responsibility and worry that had been growing heavier each day. He had offered her partnership and protection, but the partnership had become a liability that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. "Does Marcus know about Judge Thornton's discoveries?" Catherine asked. "Not yet," Helena admitted. "We wanted to discuss the situation with you first, to understand your intentions before involving him in decisions that could affect his future as much as yours." Catherine made her decision with the sudden clarity that comes when all alternatives have been exhausted. "Send word for Marcus to join us. If we're going to challenge their conspiracy, we do it together, as partners should." Judge Thornton smiled with approval. "Excellent. I'll begin preparing the necessary documents for tomorrow's hearing. Helena, can you arrange for witnesses who can testify to Thomas's business preparations and Miss Hartwell's legitimate interests?" "Already done," Helena replied with satisfaction. "I've contacted several people who corresponded with Thomas about the dressmaking venture, as well as suppliers who can verify the legitimate nature of his purchases." As Judge Thornton and Helena began planning the legal strategy, Catherine found herself thinking not about the risks they were about to take, but about the alternative. Victoria Wellington and her allies had systematically destroyed every conventional path toward building a life in Millbrook. They had used social pressure, economic manipulation, and legal corruption to eliminate what they saw as threats to their control. But in doing so, they had revealed the extent of their own vulnerability. Their power depended on operating in shadows, using legitimate procedures to achieve illegitimate goals while maintaining public facades of respectability. Exposing their methods to public scrutiny would destroy the foundations upon which their influence rested. Marcus arrived within the hour, his expression shifting from concern to amazement to determination, as Judge Thornton explained the legal discoveries and their proposed response. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable, the worried, defensive man of recent weeks replaced by someone who radiated the confidence and purpose that had made him successful in the dangerous business of mining. "How soon can we move forward?" he asked when Judge Thornton finished her explanation. "The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon," Judge Thornton replied. But I should warn you both that success will require complete commitment to seeing this through to its conclusion. They will fight back with every resource at their disposal. Marcus looked at Catherine, his brown eyes reflecting the same determination she felt building in her own chest. What do you say, partner? Ready to find out what we're really made of? Catherine thought of the burgundy silk waiting to be transformed into something beautiful, of the letters from mining camps and railroad towns seeking quality clothing services, of the future Thomas Brennan had envisioned and died believing in. Most of all, she thought of the woman she had been when she stepped off the train in Millbrook, desperate, dependent, and willing to accept whatever scraps of opportunity others might offer. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that worth wasn't determined by social acceptance or economic permission, but by the courage to fight for what was right, regardless of the consequences. "I'm ready," Catherine said firmly. "Let's show them what happens when they underestimate the wrong people." The morning of the hearing dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows, as if nature itself had conspired to illuminate the truth that would soon be revealed. Catherine stood before the mirror in her hotel room, adjusting the burgundy silk dress she had finally completed in the pre-dawn hours. The garment was her masterpiece, elegant yet practical, sophisticated without ostentation, a perfect representation of the skilled craftswoman she intended to prove herself to be. Helena had arrived early to help with final preparations, her own appearance impeccable in a navy wool dress that spoke of prosperity and respectability. "You look magnificent," she said, securing Catherine's auburn hair in an elegant arrangement that would photograph well for the newspaper coverage Judge Thornton had arranged. Thomas would be proud. "I hope Marcus feels the same way," Catherine replied, smoothing the silk skirt with hands that trembled slightly despite her outward composure. "He's risking everything on my testimony today." "You're both risking everything," Helena corrected gently. "But you're also fighting for everything that matters. Your future, your independence, and the right to build something meaningful without interference from small-minded people who mistake control for leadership." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Marcus entered, dressed in his finest suit with a bearing that commanded attention and respect. Behind him came Judge Thornton, her judicial robes lending additional gravitas to an already formidable presence. "The courthouse is filling rapidly," Judge Thornton reported. "Word of today's proceedings has spread throughout the community. I estimate we'll have an audience of over 100 people." Catherine felt her stomach clench at the prospect of defending herself before such a crowd, but Marcus stepped closer, his presence steadying her nerves. "Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves today," he said quietly. "We're fighting for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, who's ever had their dreams dismissed by people who profit from maintaining the status quo." Judge Thornton nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. This case represents far more than property rights or business disputes. It's about whether frontier communities will be shaped by vision and opportunity or controlled by fear and exclusion." As they walked toward the courthouse together, Catherine was struck by the crowds lining Main Street. It seemed as though half of Millbrook had turned out to witness the confrontation, their faces reflecting everything from eager anticipation to hostile skepticism. She recognized faces from her weeks in town, some friendly, others openly antagonistic, many simply curious about the dramatic conclusion to a story that had captivated the community. The courthouse itself was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only in the gallery, and overflow crowds gathering outside the windows. At the plaintiff's table, Victoria Wellington sat beside Mr. Caldwell and Sheriff Morrison, their expensive legal counsel clearly confident in their position. They had dressed for victory, their clothing and manner projecting the authority of established power, But Catherine noticed something else in their demeanor, a subtle tension that suggested they weren't as confident as they appeared. Judge Thornton's request for an emergency hearing had surprised them, leaving insufficient time for their usual careful preparations and strategic maneuvering. As Judge Thornton called the session to order, the crowded courtroom fell silent with an expectancy that was almost palpable. We are here today to address allegations of fraudulent claims regarding the estate of Thomas Brennan, deceased, and the unlawful detention of property belonging to Miss Catherine Hartwell. Caldwell's attorney, a sharp-faced man from Denver, rose immediately. Your Honor, my clients filed their complaint in good faith, based on legitimate concerns about irregular business practices and potential conflicts of interest in estate settlement. Miss Hartwell has no standing to claim ownership of property that rightfully belongs to the deceased's estate. Judge Thornton's smile was razor-sharp. Mr. Patterson, I appreciate your client's concern for proper legal procedures. However, I have evidence that suggests their complaint was filed under false pretenses and with full knowledge that their claims were without merit. The judge's opening statement sent a murmur through the packed courtroom. Catherine could see Victoria Wellington's face pale as she realized that their carefully orchestrated legal maneuver was about to be exposed as fraud. Miss Hartwell, Judge Thornton continued, please tell the court about your relationship with Thomas Brennan and the business arrangements he established on your behalf. Catherine rose, her burgundy silk dress catching the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. For a moment, she was aware of every eye in the room fixed upon her, but then her training as a teacher took over, and she found the calm authority that had once commanded unruly classrooms. Your Honor, I corresponded with Thomas Brennan for 6 months before traveling to Colorado Territory to marry him. During that correspondence, he learned of my skills as a dressmaker and my interest in establishing a business that would serve the growing communities throughout this region. Her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom as she described their letters, Thomas's enthusiasm for her professional ambitions, and his careful preparations for the dressmaking establishment. When she reached the point of discovering Thomas's death upon her arrival, several women in the gallery wiped their eyes at the tragedy of the situation. Mr. Brennan had made extensive preparations for my business venture, Catherine continued, including the lease of commercial space, purchase of equipment and materials, and establishment of supplier relationships throughout the region. These preparations were made specifically to support my independent professional activities, separate from any personal relationship we might have developed. Judge Thornton nodded approvingly. Miss Hartwell, did Thomas Brennan ever indicate that these business preparations were contingent upon your marriage, or that they represented personal gifts rather than professional investments? Never, Your Honor. Thomas was quite specific that he viewed our relationship as a partnership between equals, and that my business success was important to him regardless of our personal circumstances. He wanted me to have the foundation for independence, not dependence. Caldwell's attorney objected. Your Honor, Miss Hartwell's interpretation of Mr. Brennan's intentions is purely speculative, without written documentation. But we do have written documentation. Judge Thornton interrupted smoothly, producing a thick folder from her briefcase. Mr. Patterson, I present to the court the complete business records of Thomas Brennan, including incorporation papers for Hartwell Dressmaking Enterprises, established 4 months before his death, with Miss Catherine Hartwell as sole proprietor. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Catherine stared at Judge Thornton in amazement. She had known about the business partnership Thomas created, but not that he had actually incorporated a separate entity in her name. Judge Thornton continued relentlessly. These documents show that Thomas Brennan invested over $3,000 in equipment, materials, and business arrangements that legally belonged to Miss Hartwell's corporation, not to his personal estate. The complaint filed by your clients alleges theft of property that was never part of Thomas Brennan's estate to begin with. Mr. Caldwell rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Your Honor, we were not informed of any such business incorporation. If these documents exist, they were deliberately concealed from interested parties. On the contrary, Judge Thornton replied coolly, these documents were properly filed with the Territorial Business Registry, where they have been publicly available for anyone who chose to investigate before filing legal complaints. The fact that your clients failed to conduct due diligence before making serious allegations suggests either incompetence or deliberate fraud. Victoria Wellington's attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but her expression suggested that whatever advice he was giving was not what she wanted to hear. The careful legal strategy they had constructed was crumbling before their eyes. Judge Thornton called her next witness, a clerk from the Territorial Business Office who confirmed the incorporation papers and testified that the Heartfelt dressmaking enterprises had been properly established with all required legal procedures. His testimony was followed by suppliers from Denver who verified Thomas's orders and confirmed that payment had come from the business account rather than his personal funds. With each witness, the fraudulent nature of the complaint became more apparent. Thomas Brennan had not only anticipated potential legal challenges to Catherine's business, he had structured the entire arrangement to withstand exactly the sort of attack that Victoria Wellington and her allies had mounted. When Judge Thornton called Marcus to testify, his deep voice carried absolute conviction as he described his brother's excitement about Catherine's arrival and his detailed plans for the dressmaking business. Thomas believed Miss Hartwell would build something important here, something that would benefit the entire region. He wanted to ensure that her success couldn't be prevented by people who might feel threatened by change and progress. The pointed reference to feeling threatened by change brought hostile murmurs from Victoria Wellington's supporters, but it also drew approving nods from others in the gallery who understood exactly what Marcus meant. Helena Morrison's testimony provided the final piece of evidence Judge Thornton needed. As a successful businesswoman herself, Helena described her commission for Catherine's services and her plans to recommend the dressmaking business to other ranching families throughout the area. Miss Hartwell possesses exceptional skill and professional dedication, Helena stated firmly. Her success would benefit every family in this region who currently lacks access to quality clothing services. The attempts to prevent her from establishing herself here represent nothing more than economic protectionism disguised as moral concern. When Helena stepped down, Judge Thornton turned to face Victoria Wellington and her allies with an expression that promised no mercy. Mrs. Wellington, Mr. Caldwell, Sheriff Morrison, you have filed legal complaints alleging criminal activity without conducting basic investigation into the facts. You have detained property that legally belongs to Miss Hartwell's corporation. Most seriously, you have used official legal procedures to further personal and economic interests, rather than to serve justice. Victoria Wellington rose, her face rigid with fury and desperation. Your Honor, this entire proceeding is a farce, designed to legitimize an unseemly arrangement between this woman and the Brennan family. Regardless of legal technicalities, the citizens of Millbrook have a right to maintain community standards. Mrs. Wellington, Judge Thornton replied icily, community standards should be based on law and justice, not on the personal prejudices of self-appointed social arbiters. Your right to maintain standards does not extend to filing fraudulent legal complaints or detaining other people's property. The judge's rebuke sent a ripple of reaction through the packed courtroom. Several people in the gallery began whispering excitedly, while others looked shocked at seeing Victoria Wellington so thoroughly demolished by legal authority. Judge Thornton continued her devastating attack. Furthermore, I have evidence that your complaint was coordinated with Mr. Caldwell's bank to create financial pressure on Marcus Brennan, whose mining operations compete with interests controlled by your allies. This suggests a conspiracy to use legal procedures for illegal purposes. Mr. Caldwell's face went white as he grasped the implications. Judge Thornton was not merely exposing their fraud, she was building a case for criminal charges against the conspiracy's leaders. Sheriff Morrison, Judge Thornton said sharply, you will immediately return all property belonging to Hartwell Dressmaking Enterprises to Miss Hartwell's control. Any further detention of her legally owned assets will be considered obstruction of justice. Sheriff Morrison nodded reluctantly, clearly understanding that he had been manipulated into supporting an illegal scheme. Yes, Your Honor, I'll see that everything is returned this afternoon. But Judge Thornton wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation of possible criminal charges related to filing false complaints, conspiracy to defraud, and abuse of legal procedures for personal gain. The threat of criminal prosecution sent shockwaves through Victoria Wellington's faction. Several of her supporters quietly began edging toward the courthouse exits, clearly wanting to distance themselves from leaders who had led them into potential legal jeopardy. Victoria Wellington herself remained defiant to the end. This court may have the power to overturn our complaint, but it cannot change the fundamental fact that respectable families will not patronize businesses operated by women of questionable character. Miss Hartwell may recover her property, but she will never achieve success in Millbrook. Judge Thornton's smile was triumphant. Mrs. Wellington, I believe you underestimate both Miss Hartwell's character and the intelligence of your fellow citizens. Success in business depends on quality and service, not on the approval of people who mistake prejudice for principle. As the hearing concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Catherine found herself surrounded by people offering congratulations and support. Several women approached to discuss potential commissions, while men representing mining operations throughout the region inquired about clothing services for their workers. But it was Mrs. Patterson from the hotel who provided the most satisfying moment of vindication. The older woman approached with a beaming smile and a small group of other business owners who had remained neutral during the conflict. Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Patterson said warmly, we've been discussing the possibility of establishing a merchants' association to promote fair business practices and welcome qualified entrepreneurs to Millbrook. Would you be interested in joining as a founding member? The invitation represented complete integration into Millbrook's legitimate business community, exactly what Victoria Wellington had tried to prevent. Catherine accepted graciously, understanding that the offer symbolized far more than simple business cooperation. As the courthouse emptied, Marcus approached Sheriff Morrison and two deputies who had been assigned to oversee the return of Catherine's property. Ready to see what Thomas really prepared for you? Marcus asked with a smile that transformed his serious features. The return to Thomas's shop felt like a homecoming after weeks of exile. As Sheriff Morrison unlocked the door and stepped aside, Catherine entered to find everything exactly as she had last seen it. Except now, she understood that every bolt of fabric, every piece of equipment, every carefully planned detail represented not just Thomas's faith in her abilities, but her legal right to build the future she had dreamed of creating. Helena Morrison had followed them to the shop, bringing with her a surprise that made Catherine's victory complete. I've taken the liberty of contacting some of the businesses Thomas corresponded with, she announced, producing a thick envelope. Orders for custom work that should keep you busy for months, all from customers who appreciate quality over social prejudice. As Catherine examined the orders, mining superintendents requesting durable work clothes, railroad executives needing formal wear for business meetings, successful ranchers' wives wanting elegant dresses for social occasions. She realized that Thomas's vision had been even more prescient than she had understood. The market for quality clothing services extended far beyond Millbrook's narrow social circles, encompassing entire communities of people who valued craftsmanship over conformity. The final moment of triumph came as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Catherine stood in the doorway of her shop, with Marcus beside her and Helena making plans for expanding the business to serve customers throughout Colorado Territory. Thomas would be proud, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying satisfaction and something deeper that made Catherine's heart race. Thomas gave us the foundation, Catherine replied, but we built the rest ourselves, as partners should. Marcus turned to face her directly, his brown eyes reflecting the sunset light. Partners in business, certainly, but I find myself hoping we might be partners in other ways as well. The quiet declaration carried the weight of genuine affection, earned through shared struggle and mutual respect. Catherine looked into his face, no longer a painful reminder of the brother she had never met, but the features of a man who had proven himself worthy of trust and partnership in every sense of the word. I believe Thomas would approve of that as well, Catherine said softly, accepting the hand Marcus offered as they walked together toward their future. Behind them, the shop windows glowed with warm light, displaying fabrics and finished garments that would soon serve customers throughout the region. The sign above the door read, Hartwell Dressmaking Enterprises, but Catherine knew it represented something far more significant than a business venture. It represented the triumph of vision over prejudice, partnership over control, and the unshakable truth that worth is determined not by circumstance or origin, but by the courage to fight for what is right, regardless of the odds. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like stars, no longer representing a community that had rejected her, but a home where she belonged, not by permission or social acceptance, but by right of contribution and the respect earned through integrity and perseverance. Catherine Hartwell had arrived in Colorado Territory as a desperate mail-order bride, seeking salvation through marriage to a stranger. She would remain as Catherine Brennan, successful businesswoman and equal partner in both love and enterprise, having discovered that the greatest transformations come not from changing our circumstances, but from refusing to let circumstances define our worth. The future stretched ahead like the endless Colorado sky, vast with possibility and bright with promise for those brave enough to claim it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.